Aha! There's background noise coming in. Hang on, let's see if this works. Oh, Perry. Perry.
Yep.
Are you getting background noise from me?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. Your mother cooks socks in hell. Why is she cooking socks, Peter? What the hell is she doing? Scott, if you want to stay up here to speak, brother, you can be a special guest. Peter, you're a poet. What's your greatest hit's going to be, Peter? If it means I have to type every time I answer a question. Yes, you have to answer me as I talk to you every time. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Yes, I'm almost 40. I feel old as well. Tonight we're going to be talking to Jay Garfield, guys. We're still waiting for Jay to show up. So when he gets here, please, everyone, be on their best behavior. Call in if you would like, please. As always, towards the end of the show, we'll have callers. Hopefully, we have Jay for a while. So we shall see what happens. Hope everybody's doing good tonight. Yeah. Perry, if you want to be on screen, you're more than welcome to be.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to cut off. Spicy.
Spicy.
All right. The spice is nice. That's what I do. Shitloads of spice. God, spice is so terrible for you. It's 7:01, so everybody just keep. God, spice is so terrible for you. It's 7:01, so everybody just keep your britches on. The spice must flow. You're right. Gotta make the spice flow. Oh, we got our friend Jay. Jay, I'm gonna invite you to speak, and the invitation will be at the top of your screen. Okay, Jay, now if you'll look on your screen in the bottom center, you'll see the microphone and the video button. Bottom center of the screen. Okay, Jay, now if you'll look on your screen in the bottom center, you'll see the microphone and the video button. Bottom center of the screen.
Hello, am I there?
We can hear you. Absolutely. How are you?
That's something.
That's something.
Can you see me?
Right next to the audio button, if you want to, is the video button. You
Yeah,
don't have
I've
to.
clicked on the video,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem to be. I can see myself, but I don't. But you can't see me.
No, Perry, back out real quick.
Cut.
Hello.
Okay, everybody redo their stuff now. Try it one more time. Jay, I'm sorry to. This is a buggy program.
Okay. I can see myself and you,
Okay, well, as long as you can see yourself, that's fine.
but you can't see me.
I can't see you, sadly. I'm so sorry. It's a now try video. Okay, Travis, let's try relogging. What does that entail, Travis? Jay, we have Travis Pangburn who's set all this up for us, and he's trying. Okay, Jay should leave the room. Okay, Jay, do you know how to leave the room in the bottom right corner?
Let me try. Leave.
It's a black screen. Dusty, are you saying it's a black screen for us too? Yes, welcome, Aaron. All right, let's try this again, Jay. We'll invite you to speak. Thank you for being so patient with us, Jay. We really appreciate it.
And then invite him back up real quick.
All right, there we go. Got him back up to speak. Okay.
How's this?
Oh, that's
Hey!
perfect. Yes, it fixed it.
Okay, great.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Sorry, it's so complicated. I've never used
No,
this
it's
before.
it's not you, my friend, at all. It's this is a new program called Call In where people just can make their own call in show. We're part of the Pangburn Hangout, and we're working Call In where people just can make their own call in show. We're part of the Pangburn Hangout, and we're working with them, trying to make it better and better and better as it goes. So it's a new thing. These videos will be uploaded to YouTube with them, trying to make it better and better and better as it goes. So it's a new thing. These videos will be uploaded to YouTube though, so that's a plus.
Okay.
My name's Thomas Jay. Can I call you Jay? Is that all right?
You can. That's what people call me.
Excellent, excellent. This is one of my best friends, Perry, and I wanted to introduce you to the crowd, if that's okay, really quick.
Sure.
Okay. So, Professor Garfield is a prominent American philosopher who is known for his work in the field of Buddhist philosophy, philosophy of language, and cognitive science. All my favorite. Professor Garfield is a prominent American philosopher who is known for his work in the field of Buddhist philosophy, philosophy of language, and cognitive science. All my favorite things. He is currently the Doris Silbert Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at Smith College in Massachusetts. Did I get that right?
You did.
Okay. So for everybody listening in the future, he has made significant contributions to the study of Buddhist philosophy and has written extensively on topics such as many styles of Buddhistic philosophy, including the interface between Buddhism and cognitive science. So, he's worked in the philosophy of language, linguistics, logic, epistemology. The man is a polymath. So we all are very happy to have him here. I've noticed, the thing I usually ask people first, Jay, is
Yeah.
what are you working on now? What do you love? What do you love doing right now?
Gosh, those are two different questions, of course. So I do love what I'm working on.
Yeah. Either
so,
one you can answer.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, what I love more than anything else is teaching. But if you were asking what I'm working on in terms of my scholarship, I'm working on a few books in Buddhist philosophy, a couple of books on Chandrakirti, a book on a figure in early 20th century Indian philosophy, K.C. Bhattacharya, a big book on the sources of normativity, and a few other small projects. But those are the big things.
That big book on normativity. Can we talk about
Yeah.
that for a moment?
Yeah, a few
I
years
don't want
ago.
you to have to give away anything that you're not supposed to, but I just
No, that's fine. I've got no secrets.
Okay,
A
good.
few years ago, I published a book on Hume's Treatise of Human Nature called The Concealed Influence of Custom, Hume's Treatise from the Inside Out. And in that book, I offer an interpretation of the treatise as essentially a naturalistic treatise on normativity and its sources. In the last, really since the middle of the 20th century, there's been a big a domination of the field of normativity by a Kantian picture. People have seen Kant as kind of the corrective to Hume. In the book I'm working on now, I'm arguing that's a mistake, that Hume basically got it right and the Kantian turn was an error. So I'm trying to draw on Hume's naturalism and Hume's communalism to really develop an account of the sources of normativity that respects the fact that we are first and foremost hypersocial great apes.
Yes, absolutely. Perry, please comment on that.
Yeah, well, if only Hume could have been resurrected to respond to Kant. Kant seemed to do a lot of tricky things within. I mean, it took him about a decade of writing in response to Hume, and we talk about this stuff a lot. It seems like a lot of Kant's work was very esoteric. And perhaps Hume was too. I mean, his Human Nature was a big old fat book, So and so it may be difficult to interpret some of those things. But I like how you said I'm interested to hear you elaborate on how you took it from inside out, because personally, I like to when I'm kind of analyzing all of these philosophers, invert them in a way. That's the verb that I use,
Well,
so I'm curious as to what you'd say
yeah,
on that.
in the title of my Hume book, that reflects the fact that I take book 2 of the treatise, the one that's most often neglected, as the most important. And I begin the book with a discussion of book 2, and then come back to books 1 and 3, and that 2, and then come back to books 1 and 3. And that's the inside-out conceit of that book. But you probably didn't invite me here to talk about Hume studies, though I can talk about Hume forever.
Hey, we can no. This, my friend, we love talking about the technical. We're philosophers and psychologists. That's what we do here. We love it.
Yeah. All right. So then let me talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Here's what's really cool about Hume and what people don't notice too often. One is that the treatise really is a book that takes the normative dimensions of human life very seriously and kind of asks where normativity comes from. And it's grounded in three big intuitions. This sounds like a Monty Python sketch, I know, that Hume has got. One is that any account of normativity has to be naturalistic. I mean, it's called a treatise of human nature. And Hume really says at the beginning that he really wants to do a kind of Newtonian job on human beings, that is, to treat us as natural objects and see how we work. And so if you contrast that with Kant's transcendentalism, you've got two very different approaches to thinking about the normative.
Yeah.
That's one. Secondly, Hume takes us to be first and foremost social animals, whereas Kant really focuses on individual isolated knowers. And Hume takes our social context to be essential to understanding who we are. Evolutionary biology has, really borne that intuition out, evolutionary psychology. And third, Hume's a Pyrrhonian skeptic. And the important part of that is that the positive phase of Hume's skepticism is one that really takes convention, which Hume calls custom, seriously as not something that needs a bedrock justification, but rather as where we find bedrock. Remember that Hume began his intellectual life as a law student and studied law very carefully. And if you read the history of England, which far too few people read right now, and they ought to read it partly because it's just gorgeous and partly because it's it's like the last Roman history. But you see that the way Hume thinks of the history of England politically as a kind of gradual consolidation of what's initially customary law. That's got a very technical meaning in British jurisprudence, into common law, where common law means law common to the realm. It doesn't mean what we mean in America by common law. It means scripta, formal written law. And the question that Hume asks, which is a very profound one, is a question about legitimation. And the question is, is common law legitimated by customs that cede authority to the crown? Or is customary law justified by what the crown leaves over to local folks?
This is almost like the Euthyphro dilemma in a way.
a little bit in structure, but not quite. Yeah. But anyway, it's important to see that when Hume was writing, that was a debate that dominated British legal theory. And Hume was firmly on the side that said that authority comes from customary law, and the consolidation reflects gradually seeding and creating through custom central authorities. And so when Hume is looking at the treatise, thinking about human nature, he's arguing that most of what's important about us can be understood through an examination of custom. And custom's got a kind of dual sense in Hume. Sometimes it's habit, that is, it's my custom to take a walk at 6 o'clock every morning. And sometimes it's what we would call convention. But in general, it's regularity. And so when Hume looks at normativity, he, if we were to quote one of his great sources, Fortescue, would say, what's regular becomes expected. What's expected becomes a legitimate expectation. What's a legitimate expectation becomes an enforceable expectation. When we get enforcement, we get law. And so arguing that we begin with regularities and build on that. And so if you examine Hume's account of reasoning, Hume's account of the confidence in perception, Hume's account of justice, Hume's account of causal reasoning, Hume's account of personal identity, in each case you'll see that what he does is he asks, what are the customs or the conventions or the habits that underlie our talking this way? And instead of asking what justifies the way we talk in ontology. And so that really takes seriously both our collective nature, our social nature, and our natural and biological nature. And I think that's the right way to develop an account of human normativity, not by looking at transcendental conditions as Kant does.
No, we're probably on the side of the latter. What you just explained. Go ahead, Perry. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, wasn't Hume denied a teaching job because he wouldn't verbally, he wasn't religious essentially, and
that's
whatever.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and so, and that perhaps is the great irony of all of philosophy. And Hume was this jolly, giddy old guy. Perhaps, of course, he was upset by that, but what was created beyond that is nothing but irony. But yeah, I mean, he was mainly known as a historian, I'm pretty sure, for the first century after his death, and it wasn't until people started bringing, and perhaps for these religious reasons, his dialogues on religion, probably stuff like that didn't come until like a century after his death, which is very interesting. But
that's correct.
What do you think about how he thinks about custom being the more underlying foundational? That's so interesting to me, Jay, that he would think that way, because it's, to me, I think in a lot of ways, things in philosophy being socially constructed, not necessarily from not our own constructs or customs or evolutionary customs or whatever it may be. But that's so interesting that you put it that way. Perry, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of where that's the first thing that I thought of when he said that. The custom of religious authority at the time, and much of government was top down based upon that reason. He couldn't have a teaching job at wherever it was, like Edinburgh or something.
Edinburgh.
Yeah. So, but and so how he, to use some terminology that perhaps we brought up, he inverted it and tried to flip that idea, starting with whatever it was is the empirical world, and then you get customs after that. But it's irony is the one thing that comes to my mind. It seems when such a great thinker, a mighty thinker like Hume, wrote a lot of his work after being denied a teaching job. I mean, geez, imagine going back in the past and seeing David Hume being denied a teaching job, right? You drop your jaw, drop your jaw, right? So,
yeah. I love talking about that. Can I ask real quick, when you say normativity, you're meaning prescription, right? Is that what you're talking about, just in general,
That's
or
right.
the general norms of prescription?
Yeah, and it was a deep insight of Hume's that epistemic norms, that is, norms governing reasoning, and perception, norms governing justice, norms governing etiquette, norms governing language, norms governing causal reasoning, norms governing personal identity, are all of the same species, right? They're just different manifestations of the human tendency to recognize regularities and to come to govern our lives through those. And I think that was a very, very deep insight.
It is.
Part of it comes from Bernard Mandeville, but it's really Hume who puts that together. And like I say, I think that's the foundation of our hypersociality. And again, a lot of folks doing good work in evolutionary psychology see that as well. So that when we see language arise, that's when we see much larger bands of Homo sapiens coming together. And that requires social normativity, right?
Exactly.
And linguistic normativity and social normativity come together. In both cases, it's that ability to detect regularity and turn it into rules. Anyway, and I think it's really cool, by the way.
Yeah.
My two favorite guys in the history of philosophy are Hume and Chandrakirti. And so when you read my book on Hume, you'll see a lot of Chandrakirti in there too. And the very cool thing is that each of them, Chandrakirti, of course, is famous in Indian Buddhist philosophy as the guy who really articulates the doctrine of the two truths and the importance of taking conventional truth seriously as truth. And I think it's that emphasis on convention, not as something that we do instead of truth, not as something second-rate, but as the foundation of our lives. As Bacon said, custom is the great magistrate of men's lives. And Chandrakirti emphasizes the way that things like personal identity, epistemic reasoning, all of those things are based in custom. And so I think the similarities
between... You say that's like normative customs, right?
That's right, exactly.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So I think that link between what's happening in India and what's happened in Scotland a millennium later, and they're each deeply inflected by Pyrrhonian skepticism, and that emphasis on custom in the fourfold prescription. So I kind of see the roots of both of these in that very early interaction between Madhyamaka Buddhism and Pyrrhonian skepticism when Pyrrho and Timon go to India. Anyway, I just think that's kind of cool.
I think it's cool as hell. This is all fun. This is great. Well, let me ask you a question. What's the best argument for Pyrrhonism?
There's a zillion of them, of course.
There are, yeah.
But I kind of like Sextus Empiricus's argument from the criterion, but also the arguments from admixtures and from the differences in animals. So the problem of the criterion, right, is a kind of nice regress or circle problem for justification. The mode of admixtures points out that anything that we know, and this has an exact parallel in Buddhist philosophy, we only know through the mediation of our senses and cognitive apparatus.
That's right, yeah.
And so all that we're in contact with is not things in the world, but things as they show up for us.
The appearances, as Kant called them, right?
That's right, fantasia. And if you were to add to that the argument from differences in animals, I always love that one because it's one that's also common to Buddhism. You kind of imagine different kinds of sensory and cognitive apparatus equipped animals, say me, a bee, a dog, an octopus, all looking at in the same environment. Completely different worlds show up. And if we just naively look around the world and say, what does everything look like? What does everything smell like? And we have this kind of natural attitude, as Husserl called it, where we just assume that the way it shows up for us is the way it is.
Yeah, phenomenologically.
Several different perceivers doing that. And you ask, so who gets it right? Me, the bee, the dog, or the bird? And the moment you ask that question, you realize how freaking stupid it is, right?
It's a stupid question. I don't think
right on our own terms. And then if you were to ask a really dumb question, but what's the world really like, independent of how we perceive it?
Noumena, yeah.
There isn't any answer to that, right? So when Pyrrho says at that point, we enter epoche, we suspend judgment, he don't mean maybe it's like the bees do it, maybe it's like I do it. He means suspend that question. It's just the wrong question to ask.
Yes.
We can talk about how things appear to us. We cannot even talk about how they are independent of a perceiver. And I think that's a very powerful argument.
I think
And
that is
Hume
a
takes
powerful
that up
argument.
in spades. Hume's getting it from Bale, who's doing a very good job of reporting on Sextus Empiricus.
I read about Sextus. It's been a long time, but I enjoyed what I read. I don't remember hardly any of it, but
it's a great reread. Go back to it.
I will. I actually, after this conversation, since you brought up Empiricus, I want to go back and look at him. At least read the Wikipedia and maybe find some
No, pick up the text. There's cheap, really well translated editions all over the place.
Okay.
In fact, I'd say get the Halley edition because his introduction is superb.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. To everyone listening, pay attention.
Read Sextus tonight. That's your bedtime reading. He's really cool. He'll blow your mind, and you'll never think of philosophy the same again.
Yeah. Do you, of course, transcendental idealism, and we could talk about that for just a second. I have other questions for you, of course, too. We don't have to keep staying on this, but I like beating things to death sometimes. So, do you think we can escape our phenomenological network?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Could you clarify the
question?
So,
like our phenomenology, our sensory network, do you think we can get outside of that in any way? Do you think anything? I mean, like you said about the dog and the octopus, everything is having its sensory network perceiving the world, and we are too. So, like, there is no right way to perceive the world, kind of thing.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes and no. And I don't mean to be making a joke. I mean, I think there's different senses of thinking about how we can escape. One way that we do escape is we create other instruments. So you can think of our senses as kind of measuring instruments by means of which we kind of take the measure of reality. In Sanskrit, we call that pramana, which literally means something that measures. And usually translated as epistemic instruments, right? Mm-hmm. So we extend those with things like telescopes and microscopes and fMRI machines. And when we do that, we're giving ourselves access to dimensions of the world that aren't immediately available to our senses. So that's one thing that we do. But of course, we can only apprehend the output of those devices through our sensory and cognitive apparatus. So that's why I say yes and no, right? The other thing is that we can do really good neuroscientific research that give us some sense, or at least some description of how other animals experience the world. So, for instance, we know that dogs, my favorite kind of other animal, have huge olfactory bulbs, and they experience the world as volumes of smell rather than as volumes of color like we do, right? Mm-hmm. So we see colored volumes that might smell in a particular way or sound in a particular way. A dog perceives volumes of smell that might look in a particular way or feel a particular way, right? Mm-hmm. So we can't really imagine easily what that would be like, but we can come to know it, right? So that's the way of transcending the limitations of our sensory cognitive systems. But it's only a partial transcendence. That is, it's a reflective theoretical transcendence, not a phenomenological transcendence.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you mean. I don't know if I could re-explain it to the crowd again. That was beautifully put.
Oh, well, Lady Keeney got that just right. We're talking about the Indriyas, right?
Oh, okay. All right, good.
Yeah.
All right, so
you
want to elaborate?
When I say yes and no, what I mean is yes reflectively and yes epistemically, but no in terms of transforming our own experience that way.
Right.
I can't become a dog or a bat, right? But I can reflectively think about the information to which they have access. And I can't see Saturn directly, but I can put my eyes into the eyepiece of a telescope and see the rings of Saturn.
Right. Yeah, it's John Vervecchi, who I talked to earlier. He kind of likes to call that kind of stuff psychotechnologies. Like
that's right.
I think that's right how he says it, but it's enhancing our sensory network. But the thing I always get stuck on is that the proxy is always through the sensory network, through
that's right.
the world's phenomenology. So that always gets me tripped up. That's just it's a philosophical problem. So,
but that's why I said yes and no. There's one sense in which we can, one sense in which we're stuck, right? And if we're reflectively aware of that, then we can, we can come to understand our own limitations even when we can't transcend them, but we can still theoretically transcend what is naturally given to us. But
Okay.
here, yeah,
You want to elaborate on that? Go ahead.
no,
Keep going. I love that.
no,
Okay.
that's all I
Okay.
got.
Oh, that's good. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some of your. So you are trying to. What's the best way to say this?
I don't know.
You are trying to integrate Buddhist philosophy with cognitive science, like AI and everything else in cognitive science. Would I be correct in saying that?
Um, I would say only partially correct,
Okay.
and that is here's my what I've devoted a lot of my life to. It's getting people to think cross-culturally, um, because I think that to the extent, and I'm just telling you, I'm getting a pop-up window out of this that says my session's about to expire,
Uh-oh.
and as a
Oh.
security precaution, it's going to end. I'm just going to pray that that's not true.
Well, yeah. Let's just ignore that. I've never had a guest tell me that. So,
I'll
Travis, if you
ignore
know
that. Okay,
anything, yeah, ignore
I'm
that.
going to ignore
Real
that.
quick, Travis, if you know anything, post in the chat here, and we'll try to
I'm
hook Jay
I'm
up.
going to pretend it's not going to happen, but if it does happen, I'll just come back on.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to pretend it's lying to me. Um, okay,
By the way, I'm enjoying the hell out of this, so thank you so much for this.
okay. So a large part of my kind of meta-philosophical agenda is people need to be talking across cultures, because if we silo ourselves and say, if you're like in the West and you only read stuff written by white people, and honestly, this isn't a joke, right? I mean, probably 90% of philosophy departments, not just in the West, but worldwide, teach a curriculum of texts only written by white people. And what they're not willing to do is kind of like put a sign on the door that says, come in here, we only teach stuff written by white people, because that would sound really bad, right? But that's what they do, right? And that, to me, is kind of like deciding, hey, I'm only going to read books published on Thursdays, because it's going to take me a lifetime to get through the Thursday books, So, like, why even think about books published on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, right? There's so much Thursday stuff. Similarly, a lot of people say, among my Tibetan colleagues, grow up only reading stuff written in India and Tibet. And I've had interactions with people who say, yeah, of course that's what we do, because of course everybody knows that European people, they're really good at science, but they can't do philosophy. I mean, that's the kind of thing we do in India and Tibet. In the same way that a lot of my Western colleagues say, philosophy, that's a Greek and European thing. You can't even imagine it. They've got wisdom traditions, but not philosophy. And lots of people in China, right? We're looking at Chinese philosophy for a long time. Now, I think that's just all stupid, all right? Philosophy it's as stupid as deciding I'm only going to listen to Western music, I'm only going to look at Western art, or I'm only going to watch Indian dance, right? But we've allowed our discipline to grow up that way. And so a lot of my work is really devoted to saying to people, hey, look, you could actually go deeper into this subject if you would just consider these folks and be in dialogue with these folks and these ideas. So yes, I bring cognitive scientists and Buddhist philosophers together, but it's not just because I think, hey, cognitive science should be Buddhist. It's because in both traditions, there's a very profound and long tradition of asking how does the mind work and what follows from that about our experience. And they ask the questions differently sometimes, because they're coming out of different presuppositions and cultural contexts. And by stepping out, you can look back at what you're doing and say, oh my God, these are presuppositions I didn't question, and maybe they're wrong. Maybe if I looked at it this way, things would go better. And in this particular instance, that is the interaction of Buddhism and cognitive science, it's been a very fecund interaction. And it's really forced rethinking on both sides. So this is not a project of, hey, cognitive scientists need to listen to Buddhists because they're really smart and cognitive scientists are really dumb. That's not what I'm doing. Nor am I saying Buddhists don't know anything about science, so they have to listen to cognitive science. What I am doing is saying these are two really deep traditions, each of which comes with some unquestioned presuppositions and some really cool ways of asking questions. And we put them together, sparks fly.
Yeah.
And that's happening.
Diversity, synergy, new ways of thinking that are birthed from those connections.
That's
Uh,
exactly right.
exactly right. We want it to be, Phil. We want philosophy, since everything came from philosophy. We want it to be omnidisciplinary. Would you agree?
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so I
So,
think that's really important.
yeah, I was going to ask, like, what do you take from the other dharmic traditions? Do you ever?
Um, I do. I mean, that is, I've been spending a lot of time in the last 20 years with my
Mm,
colleague Nalini Bhushan, looking at modern Advaita Vedanta philosophy, which I find really fascinating as well. Um, and of course, Buddhists and Vedantins agree about some things, disagree about others. And on some of those, I kind of side on one side, and some I kind of flip to the other side. But I really find the way that Vedantins think, especially about cognitive illusion, for instance, really powerful and really interesting, as well as the way that they develop a phenomenology of subjectivity. Um, and I think there's just a whole lot to be said about really deep dialogue, especially with modern Indian philosophy. By that I mean philosophy during the British period, late 19th and early 20th century, which was
yes,
an astonishing period. And I've got a cool book about that too with my colleague Nalini Bhushan called
yeah,
Minds Without Fear. That's a history of philosophy in that period, if you're interested in that stuff,
I
as
am
well as
interested
a
in
big
this.
fat
Say
anthology
that book one more time for our audience.
called, called Minds Without Fear,
Mine.
Philosophy in the Indian Renaissance.
Excellent. Philosophy
Yeah,
in the Indian Renaissance, and that
yeah,
was the. See, historically, I may be a little deficient here. That was the Indian Renaissance in terms of
yeah. So we're
their
thinking
spiritual
about
movement.
1857 to 1947, the 90 years of Crown rule,
So,
which was a time when there was just tremendous interaction between Indian and European philosophy.
mhm.
Indian philosophers are reading and writing in English and really trying to join um, classical Vedanta and Nyaya with especially Kantian and British neo-Hegelian philosophy and phenomenology, as well as the beginnings of behaviorism. And so there's just a whole lot of attention as Indian philosophers are kind of looking at what's happening in the history of European philosophy and
Mhm.
trying to imagine what they're doing in dialogue with that. But really also very deliberately reaching back to the history of Indian philosophy because they're in a project of trying to build a nation and run an independence movement at the same time.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
things get very, very cool very fast.
Yeah, not enough time for philosophy, too much time for war or
Yeah,
discord
yeah.
or something, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
Let's.
Lady Duquesne's talking about Samkhya too, and
Okay, go ahead.
she's dead right about that. That Samkhya is the other really interesting player in this debate. So we put together Nyaya and Vedanta and Samkhya, and they're all really active and actively being developed during the Renaissance time. But
And
that's
those
what
are,
I'm
just for
mostly
our
about.
audience, those are types of
Those
Indian
are schools
philosophy.
of thought in from classical Indian philosophy that are
Gotcha.
still very much alive today. And it's
Gotcha.
really important to remember India is not the past. It still exists.
Yeah, it does, and a vast majority of people live on that continent that aren't us. We're only 300. The West is
Small.
what, a billion people, maybe.
Yeah.
Uh,
And Western
so
philosophy is a small corner of the philosophical world.
yeah,
People forget that. The
that's
Chinese
true.
tradition is vast. The Indian
Chinese
tradition
tradition
is
is
vast.
older than Greek tradition. Would that be okay
Absolutely.
to say? Yeah,
Absolutely. And the Indian
absolutely.
tradition is just as old, and they're both really big. African philosophy, really old and really big. Native American philosophy, really worth paying attention to. Mesoamerican philosophy, fascinating. I mean,
Wow.
we just need to expand our vision. And that's what a lot of my work's been devoted to, just saying to people, expand your damn vision. If you really care about ideas, don't
Yeah.
become a subdiscipline of white studies.
Yeah, well, like you said about Thursdays, I mean, yeah, we do
Yeah,
have a lot of Western analytical and continental philosophy to follow and learn and all of this, and
and
that's how
it's
we got
way
the
cool.
science and all this kind of stuff. But we lose, and I think Dao Su, one of my friends in here, would agree with me. We lose that transcendental nature, not transcendental in the Kantian way, but transcendental
Yeah.
in, like, I guess, the spiritual way. I don't, I don't know how to describe that, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish that more people cared like you do about the interdisciplinary study of different philosophical traditions. But I see people, obviously, like you said, 90% is written by white people. So how do we change that? How do we get that? What do we do?
Well, we do a lot of things. I think one is, as I say, we just get people in philosophy to pay a lot more attention to non-European traditions. That's happening, by the way. Um, and it's not happening as fast as I would like or as broadly as I would like, but it's happening. Um, that's one thing. Second thing that we do is we engage in really active, respectful collaboration with people whose homes are in other philosophical traditions. And the way I often put that when I'm talking to my students, say, it's one thing to say we want to learn about another tradition. It's another thing to say we want to learn from another tradition. The
Yes.
first one makes us puts us in the subject position, and the other tradition in the object position, and then just reinscribes a kind of white privilege, right? That we're the ones who get to learn about them. And learning from means that we actually open ourselves to the possibility that we're going to be transformed and change our way of thinking by doing that. And that requires real dialogue. And that requires having colleagues and collaborators who come from those traditions. So you may have noticed that a lot of my work is published with Tibetan co-authors, where we work together on this stuff, or Indian.
I did read that, actually. That's impressive.
Yeah. And I think that's methodologically really super important. Another thing that we do is we pay attention to our hiring. And we really try hard to be hiring people who are trained primarily in other traditions. And so I get this a lot, right? So I recommend somebody for a job, and maybe they're an expert in Chinese philosophy, and that's what they do. And somebody says, yeah, but they can't teach our Western philosophy courses. And I say, yeah, you've got other people doing that. How many Chinese philosophy course, right? Oh, we'd like to hire him, but we need somebody who also does. And I want to say, no, you don't. You already do that shit, right? You need somebody who does the stuff you don't do. And so to take seriously the idea that being trained just in Indian philosophy or just in Native American philosophy is every bit as valuable as being a Kant scholar who's just trained in Western philosophy. And that just as you might hire somebody who only does ancient Greek philosophy and say doesn't do philosophy of science, you can hire somebody who just does classical Indian philosophy and doesn't do cognitive science, right? Or doesn't do Aristotle. And so really taking seriously that vision of what a department will look like. And when you do that, then you're going to welcome students in from lots of different backgrounds. And so your student body isn't all European guys, and I'm using guys here because philosophy also has a gender problem.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
So it's not just a bunch of white guys reading white guys, right? Because the longer philosophy is white guys reading white guys, the more boring, irrelevant, and pointless it becomes. And I can't honestly think that we ought to be devoting resources to that, right? Because really what we should be doing is really trying to build out cross-culturalism. And so that's kind of what
the more you diversify your understandings in philosophy, the more you diversify your understanding in the scientific methodology, I would think. But
absolutely, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't mean just because we study Dharmic traditions that we throw philosophical skepticism out the window. You know what I mean? Or anything like that.
We don't check our minds at the door and
No.
decide that somehow because it comes from the East, it must be true and just pray to it. Right. Any more than we check our minds at the door and decide, gosh, there can't be anything interesting there.
Yeah.
But what we do is open our minds, and that's just super important. It's important intellectually because it's stupid to say I'm not going to learn about that stuff. It's important ethically because when we ignore people, we deprecate them. That's a way of telling people they're not worthy of our attention, and that's immoral. It's politically bad because it doesn't allow us to interact with other folks around us. Yeah. And what I try to convince philosophy departments of is that it's also just plain stupid if you want to continue to be funded, because most departments are funded by according to how many students they've got, and students are leaving the humanities in droves, and philosophy departments are losing funding. And guess what? Students really love global philosophy.
Well,
So
it
you
sounds like
have more
it sounds
students
like
to
it's
keep your
stagnating
department
and
alive.
people are running away, right?
Yeah.
Like
So
it's
all in
yeah.
all, it just all has to be done.
Yes, I agree. I think
Yeah.
that the move towards the interdisciplinary among the philosophy is going to help us overall. Period.
Yeah.
Perry,
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. Perry, did you have something you wanted to say? I thought you were thinking there.
Yeah, no. I've been enjoying the conversation. I recently have been asking some friends, who I know are more well acquainted with Eastern philosophy, and that personally is my next step in the journey is to learn more about the Eastern philosophy. Now, I usually don't defend Kant, but what people like Kant seem to do, now we're in the Western tradition, of
Yep.
course,
I
is,
defend Kant a lot. So we'll go ahead. Yeah.
well, I mean, he tried to marry the two concepts of empiricism and rationality. And this idea of marrying these concepts or having them omnidisciplinary, as you guys mentioned, seems to be perhaps a very beneficial move of us, especially when it comes to the philosophy of mind and or psychology, the sciences, humanities, whatever you want to call it. The only issue is someone like Schopenhauer, who didn't perhaps intentionally try to marry these things, but at least he was, influenced by Buddhist tradition. He read the Upanishads, talked about the Veil of Maya quite a bit.
Yep.
And, sometimes, obviously, we're going to have different interpretations of how we ought or how we're going to end up marrying these two concepts. But I can only see benefits coming from this idea of interdisciplinary ideas coming from multicultural. You don't want to be in an echo chamber. You want knowledge to be as accessible as possible to everyone. The whole capitalistic notion that, the humanities aren't getting enough funding because there's not a lot of people. I mean, it sucks. It really sucks. And, I mean, well, that's a separate thing. But I know you were talking about, the contrasting aspects of Western and Eastern philosophy of mind. What are some comparisons, perhaps, that you've observed that where we have tried to marry these concepts in such a way to get this omnidisciplinary telos that perhaps some of us are trying to get to?
Sure.
What do you see?
I'm going to start by being a little methodologically snarky, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna worry about the metaphor of marriage that you're using there.
Sure. Give me a
Because,
different verb to use.
well, no. Here's what I mean by that. That, for instance, the way that Kant tries to, and largely succeeds in overcoming the apparent antinomy between empiricism and rationalism is a different thing from what Schopenhauer is doing by trying to bring together insights from India and insights from Europe. Schopenhauer is genuinely doing a kind of cross-cultural philosophy and trying to draw insights from each tradition. What Kant is trying to do is to show why empiricism and rationalism were each wrong on their own terms and need to be their
Together.
insights can only be brought together by a different view, right?
Yes,
And that
yes.
is a theory of mental activity that involves synthesis. So,
Yes.
so I think the idea that what gets occluded when we talk about marriage is there's a lot of different ways to take two different things into consideration, and they're not all the same.
Absolutely.
And so the reason I'm saying that is because I think that the way to understand what's happening in the contemporary interaction between Buddhism and cognitive science is neither of those two. It's not what Kant did. It's not what Schopenhauer did. And when I say that, it's not to deprecate them. What Kant did was brilliant, because what Kant saw was that rationalism and empiricism both failed because of a kind of passive view of the mind, and that we needed a theory of synthesis, of mental activity, to understand cognition. And what Schopenhauer did was brilliant, because Schopenhauer saw that when we look at transcendental idealism through a Kantian lens, we fail to take seriously the idea of cognitive illusion. And that unless we think in terms of cognitive illusion, then we're not going to understand the relationship between cognition and representation and reality. And those are both really important advances. So I'm not want to disparage them, but just to say that in the 21st century, a different thing is happening. And it's happening in the following ways. One is that by looking at the difference between a kind of intuition that drives a lot of that's driven in the past a lot of Western cognitive science, namely that what confronts the world is a kind of individual mind that is taking information in, processing it, representing it, and then acting. And representation as something that accurately reflects the world and that explains our cognitive success. If we operate on the Buddhist intuition, we see instead an organism engaged, inflected by social convention, in open causal interaction with the world. And we see simply a stream of psychophysical interactions with the world whose function is not necessarily representation or accuracy, but what we might call perceptual behavioral coordination.
Okay.
And so when we look at the world that way, and we see ourselves as organisms being affected by things outside of us, being affected by our conspecifics, and having effects on our conspecifics and things outside of us, and see that simply as a complicated, multi-dimensional causal flow that involves what we might think of as top-down and bottom-up influences.
Yeah.
That's inflected by language, inflected by culture, and that you can't understand any of these particular interactions without understanding all of these dimensions. You end up with a different way of thinking about cognition, and you end up with a different way of thinking what the behavioral sciences are about. That's one thing. Second, when we look at the Buddhist analysis or the Buddhist approach to thinking about mind, we find ourselves again forced to confront the idea that to think that there are basic psychological data that are given to us in experience is a fantasy. And to think that all that we have are our minds as they appear to us, that the introspective sense is not an immediate deliverance of what's going on inside of us. So that when we ask people to report on their experience, what we're not getting is their experience. What we're getting is an introspective access to their experience. And that forces a different layer of analysis that makes everything that we do that makes use of human report different. Or we find that because the Buddhist tradition, like a lot of other Indian traditions, has developed a plethora of technologies for cognitive transformation, we're able to use some of those technologies to study technologies, to get a deeper understanding of cognitive plasticity, to get a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of attention, and to get a deeper understanding of the interaction between affective and moral dimensions of our lives and cognitive dimensions of our lives. Now, all of those, this is not kind of like preaching. This is saying if you start looking at the literature on contemplative science and the literature on cognitive science by people who've been paying attention to Buddhism, you just see really good, hardcore empirical psychology being done that's asking new and different questions, that's taking data seriously in different ways, and that's developing radically new theoretical models. That's really cool interaction. And that's a little bit different in form either than what Kant is doing when he's looking at Berkeley and Descartes and saying, guess what, you guys? You've each got half the picture, but it's not because you got half the picture. It's because you got the wrong methodology. It's different from what Schopenhauer's doing by saying, gee, there's a dimension in Asian philosophy that we need to bring in, or we're not going to understand transcendental idealism properly. Our scientific presuppositions about how we think about the mind are coming to us from a melange of Christianity and early modern philosophy, and it's just too narrow a beam from which to get intuitions about the mind. And that's why I say if we step outside, we get different questions. Does that help a little bit?
It helps definitely. Amazingly.
Yeah. It seemed like you had a lot of historical types of notions to it. I mean,
now, somebody keeps asking again and again what I think about Zhuangzi. He's come up a bunch of times here. So I'm going to answer that question.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it. I've just been watching this chat and seeing Zhuangzi come up again and again. And that I've just been watching this chat and seeing Zhuangzi come up again and again. And that's not surprising, because here's anybody who's read the Zhuangzi, anybody. Then you ask them after they've read the Zhuangzi, what's the coolest philosophical text you've ever read? Then, like, in a millisecond, they say the Zhuangzi, right? Because it is a real... It's not surprising, because here's anybody who's read the Zhuangzi, anybody. Then you ask them after they've read the Zhuangzi, what's the coolest philosophical text you've ever read? Then, like, in a millisecond, they say the Zhuangzi, right? Because it is a really wonderful philosophical text. So you want to know what I think about it? I think it's just fabulous, and you can spend half your life with the Zhuangzi and not figure out everything that's going on in there. But one of the things I really love about the Zhuangzi is that Zhuangzi, more than anybody else, has really taken the idea of groundlessness deeply seriously, and developed some of the most interesting skeptical arguments in the history of philosophy. And so I'm thinking about the second chapter of the Zhuangzi, the chapter on the transformation of things. Of course, that's the other thing. The Zhuangzi really takes pride. Then I'll do it for you as Zhuangzi does it.
Okay.
And it's a really nice way of seeing both how you get analogous ideas in different traditions, but how if you look at one of them from the vantage point of the other, you see something you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So I'm going to give you a little lesson in cross-cultural philosophy. Okay?
I'm ready.
I hate the idea. I hate the phrase comparative philosophy. We're not just comparing. We're actually using these things together. It's cross-cultural philosophy. Okay? So let's start in Greece with Sextus Empiricus. And so Sextus says, hey, if we have kind of observer-independent knowledge and we've got some kind of absolute knowledge of the world, then we need a criterion that allows us to decide whether the conclusion of an argument, whether it's from evidence or from premises, is justified or not. That is, we need a kind of a way of telling what the good arguments are and what the bad arguments are, a criterion for that, okay? And he said, well, that criterion is either going to be deductive or inductive. That is, we're either going to be arguing, it's either going to be a deductive argument that says, and therefore, this stuff is good evidence, or an inductive argument that says, yeah, I've used this evidence before, and so forth, right? All right, he says. So we've got so suppose you propose a criterion. Then you're proposing that you know that that's a criterion. And so if you know that, you either know it based on deductive or inductive evidence. Suppose you know it by deductive evidence. If so, you need to know that the argument that you're offering is valid. But to know that it's valid, you need a criterion for valid arguments. That argument
becomes arbitrary.
If it's deductive, you've got an infinite regress. If it's inductive, then let's look at inductive arguments. If you want to know that an inductive argument's good, you've got to have some justification for thinking that's a really good argument. Well, if it's deductive, we're back to the problem that we don't have a criterion for deductive arguments. But if you have an inductive argument, Hume picked up on this, for the validity of inductive arguments, then you've got to regress again. So Sextus says there's no criterion to determine whether arguments are good. And because for the validity of inductive arguments, then you've got to regress again. So Sextus says there's no criterion to determine whether arguments are good. And because there's no criterion to determine whether arguments are good, we can't even provide any argument for the claim that, say, even perceptual knowledge is good.
That would be the skeptical answer, right? Yeah.
That's right. So that's Sextus's version of the problem of the criterion. In order to know anything, we need a criterion for successful arguments, but any attempt to give one will either be circular or regressive, so we can't have one, so we can't. Attempt to give one will either be circular or regressive, so we can't have one, so we can't know anything. Okay, that's Sextus. Now, we're going to journey over to China, and we're going to see what Zhuangzi says. Now, I'm going to be working from memory here because I don't have my Zhuangzi in front of me. So the quotation won't be perfect. So it's going to be like, here's roughly what Zhuangzi says, okay? And I'm going to first give it to you as Zhuangzi puts it, then I'm going to decipher it for you, okay? He says, better to use a non-point to show that a point is not a point than to use a point to show that a point is not a point. Better to use a non-horse to show that a horse is not a horse than to use a horse to show that a horse is not a horse. The whole world is one great point. All the myriad things are one great horse. Now that's pretty obscure, right? That's the fun about Zhuangzi. Everything's metaphorical. So now I'm going to unpack it, okay? I'll start with the point. So he's talking about making a point. And what he wants to do is, if you want to try to argue, as some skeptics will, so he's now taking the reverse position, that nothing that you say really has any determinate meaning. So it's just a little bit reversed, right? Then, if you want to do that, you'd be better off using something that's meaningless to do that than something that's meaningful. Because if you use something meaningful to try to show that meaning isn't grounded, then you're going to be undermining your own position. Mm-hmm. But, again, the whole world is one great point. The moment you made it meaningful, because otherwise you can't show it. So he said you can't get out. The line there is, then we'll get to the horse, that if you're trying to undermine discursive practices, you can't do it because you're always caught within your discursive practices. But notice that also shows us that you can't go outside those discursive practices to ground them. So it shows you that, guess what? You are stuck in completely ungrounded discursive practices. And you can't escape either by grounding them or by trying to use something non-discursive instead of discursive practices. Then the horse. When we talk about horse here, horse is a metonym for an argument. And that's a little piece of Chinese philosophy about the white horse argument, right? So he says, suppose you want to show, like Sextus, that arguments aren't probative, that they're not dispositive. He said, well, it would be better for you to use a non-argument than an argument to do that, because what you're trying to show is that arguments aren't any good. So if you use an argument, you're an argument to show that arguments are no good. Because you're using it to show something, it becomes an argument.
Yeah.
So once again, we're stuck within the realm of reason. We can't help but reason. But that also means, since we can't get outside of it, as Sextus pointed out, we can't justify reason, but we also can't criticize it. Because the only way we can criticize it would be either by using reason
Yeah, I was
or by
about to
using
say, you
non-reason.
used reason to get to the whole problem of the criterion in the first place, right?
Exactly. Now you've seen the point. Once we go to Zhuangzi, we get a deeper perspective on Sextus.
Yes.
Because we see that the problem of the criterion, frightening though it is a special case of a more general point. That we find ourselves trapped in discursive and probative practices that we cannot externally justify, nor can we criticize. And that basically that's when Sextus says, all myriad things are a single horse, right? Everything is one point. That's what he means, right? And that's a somewhat deeper problem, a deeper way of seeing the same problem than the way Sextus gives it. So that's really cool. This is an example of the value of cross-cultural philosophy, because we can use Sextus to illuminate what Zhuangzi is doing. But once we do that, we see that Zhuangzi is showing that what Sextus is up to is a special case of a much more profound.
Yeah. I mean, the general idea is that you're coming back to that problem, the circular or the infinite regress. And you're not actually justifying, with studying epistemology, the theories of justification, the Munchausen trilemma,
Right. But notice that where
as
Sextus thinks that what that shows is that this stuff is just, we can't trust it, we can't use it. What Zhuangzi is saying is, guess what? What this shows is you don't have any choice. That's the human condition. You are a discursive, rational creature. Get used to it. And
So acceptance is the big thing here.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
I love it.
So that's an example of why cross-cultural philosophy is so gorgeous. Yeah, there you have it.
That was awesome. That was so good. I don't want to keep you too long, my friend. If you feel like you need to go or anything.
No. You told me I was in it for 90 minutes, and so far we're only 63
All right,
minutes.
good. That's excellent. Let's see if we've got any callers. We have a caller, and we're going to bring a caller in, if that's okay with you, Jay.
Sure.
All right. This is our friend Kapow. Let's bring him in. All right, Kapow, are you with us?
Hi, Dr. J. I'm really excited to read your books. I just looked up all of them, and all of them seem so interesting. My name is Paul, and I'm an artist.
Cool.
And I was originally born in India, but I was raised here in the West.
Yep.
And I explore mostly movement, like dance and animation.
Neat.
And my question for you is about art, actually.
Oh, cool.
Do you know examples of art that represents Eastern philosophy or ideas for a Western audience without too much of an Orientalist influence? So.
Gosh, that's a really interesting question. So you mean stuff that's not
or it can be ones that are Eastern, but that are accessible to Westerners without experience with it. I'm interested in this for I guess personally for my own work a little bit. So.
Yeah, that's easier for me. I'm really having trouble thinking of the Western examples that aren't Orientalist. I think that a lot of Chinese Buddhist art and Chinese Taoist art, as well as almost all of Japanese Buddhist art, is really pretty easy to read if you've just got any kind of artistic sensitivity and openness. Um, but it's Asian, right? I mean, it's Chinese or Japanese, and you have to have enough kind of openness in your vision to be willing to read that. Um,
Hmm.
of course, there's a lot of really interesting contemporary Tibetan art that is, exploring kind of more Western inflected ways of seeing things. That's actually pretty cool. There's a whole genre of, 21st century Tibetan art that gets pretty cool. Um, but I'm trying to think of stuff that's being done by effectively Western artists in that direction.
Maybe I have some shoes to fill right there. That's okay. I think that's a good place to. That's okay. I don't have any leads at all right now. I mean, I mostly studied the Ramayana and then the Bhagavad Gita,
Yeah.
and that's about it. And I also studied some Indian classical dance, but
Oh, cool. Which style?
uh, Bharatanatyam and then some Kathak. Awesome. I'm actually from the east, so I'm from Charkhand.
Oh, cool.
So
Not far.
so um, all of the dance and folk art there is indigenous. It's
Yeah.
like Adivasi or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really neat. That's really neat. Do you sing as well?
Yes.
Oh, that's too bad. Because there's just a whole lot of really interesting folk inflected Indian classical from Jharkhand and Bihar. That's lots of really cool dodgers and things like that. That's really
Oh, do
nice.
you know the name? I'll look
Excuse
it
me?
up. Do you know the name? I'll look it up too.
Oh, I would just do a kind of search for dodgers and dunes.
Okay.
And there's tons of stuff on YouTube. A lot of that comes out of the Varanasi Gharana.
Hmm.
Because what's distinctive about the Varanasi Gharana is this really willingness to draw on local folk music.
Okay, interesting. I
And
also
a
do
lot of
like
that comes out of
Odissi.
Bihar.
Odissi is coming out of the east too, as
Yeah,
well, I guess. And
absolutely.
that's that one. Something I find interesting about that one is that they use a lot of asymmetrical balance.
Yep, yep.
So, all right. Well, thanks for your time. I'll
You
look for
bet.
some
Good
other
luck to you.
callers. Yeah, thank you.
Bye. All right, before we take tree, Jay, you're awesome, man. I love you so much. Thank you for coming and hanging out with us, man. Let me
Yeah.
ask Scott, are you here? Scott, you been listening? Are you here with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
What's up, brother? What's on your mind?
I don't know. For me, when I think about like I probably come to this conversation like a child walking into a movie theater with no frame of reference, but like me, the thing that I really found interesting about Buddhism was this idea that was presented to me that our conscious experience is we're just a passenger in a car. We're just taking things that come in, and the only thing that you can do is deal mentally with what's actually coming in through your sensory perception, right? And your consciousness is separate from that in a way, I guess.
What do you think, Jay?
Um, I'd say I'd be a little careful with that.
Mm.
Um, that there's something to that metaphor. And what there is to that metaphor is that lots of what happens to us has nothing to do with our agency. And I think that's a really deeply important insight. Um, that's a kind of a metaphorical way of putting the idea of dependent origination. That every moment of our experience, every aspect of
Exactly.
a very tiny proportion of people were literate. So when you say, gee, nobody's reading the Bhagavad Gita, shit, for most of Indian history, nobody could read the Bhagavad Gita. Only a few people could read the Gita, or any other text for that matter. They were kind of academic specialty matters. So that's not something new. And one way to put the point is, I mean, here I am in the United States, which is a broadly Abrahamic culture. If I were to go into my classroom and ask how many of you have read the Bible, I mean, really read it, like cover to cover, no hand is going to go up, because nobody in America reads the Bible either, right? Yeah, okay, some people, not many. I remember once when I was teaching the book of Job, and I had a student who was very upset with it, and she said, I can tell you one thing about whoever wrote this book, that he never read the Bible. Which I said was dead right. But anyway, leave that part aside. So that's one thing. So I wouldn't sort of draw any really interesting inferences from that. I think what you're seeing is a combination of the fact that was reading the Gita was never a part of Indian culture, though the Gita has been in the background of Indian culture for a couple of thousand years. Just as, say, reading the Bible isn't a big part of Western culture, even though the Bible's been at the background of Western culture for a long time. So I would not put too much stock in that. The other thing, so back to the second question, which is, do I think that Indian culture is being transformed? Well, yeah, every culture is being transformed. If Buddhism teaches you one thing, it's that all phenomena are impermanent and they're all inflected by causes and conditions. And one of those is globalization. So it's true that right now, Indian culture and Irish culture are closer to one another than they were years ago. They're closer to one another partly because European culture, especially British culture and Irish culture through the colonization of India, in which a lot of Irishmen were involved as well as Scots and Brits, brought a lot of British Isles culture into India. It's also true that period brought a lot of Indian culture into Ireland. So I'll bet you can find an Indian restaurant within about a mile of your house, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of Irish culture being transformed by India. And you've read the Bhagavad Gita as an Irishman. And so that's, again, Irish culture being transformed by India. So what we see in globalization is an increasing interaction between cultures that is, unfortunately or fortunately, resulting in a kind of a leveling up or a kind of homogenization. Should we lament that? Well, maybe, because it's always sad when things change. Should we celebrate it? Sure, because it's always great when things change. And as Joni Mitchell sings beautifully, something's lost and something's gained by living every day. And that's as true of cultures as it is of individuals, I think.
And
notice that that's always been happening. So let me put a footnote on that one. If we think what's Indian culture, my God, for one thing, when the British came to India, there were over 200 countries on the subcontinent, lots of different languages. India has been conquered by Aryans and ruled by Aryans, then ruled by Afghans, then by Mughals, and by Mongols. I mean, it's just, all of those are part of Indian culture, right? So if we look at, say, the Indian classical music we were talking about before, and you say, that's authentically Indian. Well, yeah, if by authentically Indian you mean Persian, it's really authentically Indian. If we're, the idea of cultural purity, that we've had a pure culture that's been adulterated, is a bullshit idea from the start, no matter what culture you look at, because people have been talking to one another and moving around and sharing ideas and picking up really cool instruments forever. Listen to what you call authentic Spanish music, flamenco. It's all deriving from Persia, right? Because it's coming from guitars, which come from Persian lutes, and the modes are coming from there. But so is Chinese music, right? Because the pipa is another version of the Persian lute, and you've got the same pentatonic scales, right? Honestly, don't ever talk about cultural purity or you're out of your mind. Greece, somebody's saying, give me a friggin' break. Culture arose through interactions with Etruscan culture, Arabic culture, North African culture, all kinds of stuff flying into Greece, Lydian culture. There's never been a pure culture. Maybe when Homo sapiens sapiens first walked out of Africa, their culture was pure.
Maybe
And it got
so.
polluted the moment they met the first Neanderthals, I promise you.
Very probably so. Tree, we got. I think.
Do you mind if I
Well,
respond to that real quick?
well, real quick. I just need to. Are you okay with taking one more caller, or do you need to go, Jay? We don't want to keep you too long.
One more caller, then I'm going to go to sleep because I'm wasted.
Okay, thank you so much for staying with us. Tree,
No worries.
respond to that real quick, and then I'm going to get Honenheim in here for a last question. Okay.
Yep.
Sure. I mean, I agree with the idea of impure culture. In fact, I'm trying to make my culture as impure as possible. But the issue I'm seeing more is actually one of the I think the important parts about culture is to take from your parents what worked, what was good about whatever culture you're coming in, and then adapt that to your new reality and merge it in with other things, right? To learn from the past of your own culture.
Absolutely.
And I think that within a lot of countries that are suddenly being hit with new mobile phone access, and then suddenly their culture becomes it becomes a kind of very secondary thing. I'm wondering because I mean American culture is kind of really fed into the internet already. So isn't there something where
That's right.
kind of like
All right, I'm going to stop you now because I'm going to be off in a minute. Okay, I'm going to stop you now. I hear what you're saying. I just want to give you a counterpoint from somebody from a culture that one might think of as in threat. Okay, and it's from a close Tibetan colleague of mine who says that when he meets Westerners, he often feels like they want to preserve his culture as it was in the 14th century and want him to perform that for them because they've got this view of Asian cultures as belonging in dioramas in museums. And while people in the West are really happy for Western culture to continually evolve and change, the moment they see a non-Western culture evolving, suddenly something that was there for their delectation as a kind of quaint ancient thing is changing, and that upsets them. And it's worth interrogating that attitude constantly. Are we willing to continually change, but we want other people to stay the same so that we can appreciate their exoticism? And I think that's a huge danger in intercultural interactions.
Yeah. So
that's not what I was saying, but I'll drop now. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tree. We've got to let Jay go.
Yeah.
Jay, I want to plug all of Jay's books. I don't have enough time to say them all, but please go look up our man Jay Garfield here. Go look up his books, buy them, buy all of his works. Please subscribe to the Penguin Hangout, and please go. And Jay, do you have a YouTube or anything that anyone should be subscribing to, or?
No, I just want to say thank you for this time. I've had a really good time talking with everybody and responding to questions. I hope it's been useful to you. It's been fun for me. And I thank you for the opportunity. And really
you can come back anytime. Thank you very much, my friend.
Later for you.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night. All right, guys. Honenheim, I'm sorry, brother, man. Let me bring you in here. We'll remove Jay from the queue. Okay. Everybody still here with me? Scott, Perry, Honenheim?
Yep, I'm here, man.
All right. Tree, you're here with us. Let's get Honenheim speakers. Invite to speak. We'll get Tree back on. Tree, I'm sorry I had to cut you off. I'm really sorry. I get yelled at if I let more than one question fly. There we go. Okay, and we're getting Tree back in here. Tree. All right. So, what did everybody think? What do you think about melding Buddhist philosophy and Dharmic traditions with the ideas of psychology and philosophy in Western tradition? What do we think?
I would say if it works at particular times, fuck yeah. I mean, do what works.
That's pragmatism right there.
Yeah, no, like, that's something that well, that's just I think that's just the way it is, right? I mean, like all of history, all the things that we have now, we still just do them because they work, right?
Yeah, that's the pragmatic part of it.
Yeah.
Um, Travis, what do you think, boy? Travis. Yes.
Simon.
Philosophy. Yes. 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 Yeah, that's a really good point. He made a lot of really good points. Yeah, can you hear me? Hello? Hello, Travis. Travis. Travis, we can hear you. Hello? 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 Yes, I can hear you. Yes. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Yeah, I got it. Can you hear us now? Okay. We need to have Travis. We need to have more people that are integrating this omni interdisciplinary, ideal about philosophy. Because I mean, Jay impresses me more than a lot of people who focus on Western philosophy. It's all good. But yeah, no, definitely a amazing conversation, and I loved learning more about the synergy between what we can use Buddhist or Dharmic traditions to perhaps enhance our understanding of empiricism and rationalism and the scientific method. It's kind of what Yep. That's correct. That's very correct. I mean, definitely. That's exactly what it could be. I want Dalsu up here so bad, but I don't see him down in the. Dal, are you down there? Are you with us? Dalsu, call in and get your butt up to the speakers here, son.
Um,
Go ahead, Tree. Go ahead, Tree.
yeah, so I think he misunderstood the point I was going for. It wasn't so much that I wanted them to preserve their culture any more than anyone else. It was more that not having access to your culture is such a damaging thing for a nation in general. Like not having access to your history, really, and if there's such a if there's a large and dramatic disconnect, it can create this into the next group, and even if it is remixed, which
Damn it. I messed up, Tree. I fucked up. I hit the wrong button. I was trying to invite you to speak and get Peter in here. God damn it.
did you
Sorry.
did you hear all that or?
Yeah, I heard the first part. I just accidentally cut off the last part. Go ahead, finish what you were saying. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's just like, if you have a situation where a culture is abruptly disconnected from their past, it creates a kind of a country that doesn't have any ability to like identify itself as strongly with its or make any kind of